And we're live. Well, welcome back to the Belgium Cup podcast. I'm your host, David Bell. And on today's episode, we'll be taking a look at round 13 of the 2025 Formula One World Championship, with this week's Grand Prix being held at the Spa-Francochamps Circuit in Belgium. Now, let's get ready for those 5 green lights, and we'll be underway. So, we're going to kick this week's episode off by having a look at some of the top stories that kind of appeared over the last week or so. So the big story from this weekend, or going into this weekend, was around Christian Horner, as he was as he was recently fired from Red Bull with immediate effect. Now, that firing or that cancelling of contract, or whatever you end up want to calling it, brought an end to a 20-year-long career. Now, under his leadership, Red Bull did see a lot of wins. They did win a lot. Now, under his leadership, they did win 8 drivers' championships with 6 constructors. Now, regardless of how you feel about the guy or how you view him, depending on or whatever's happened with him, his personal life, Red Bull, whatever it might be, over the past couple of years, it's without question he is one of the most successful team principals F1 has ever seen. Now, with a CV like his, there's no doubt we're going to see him back on the grid sometime soon. Now, in what capacity that's going to be is still unknown. Is he going to take over another team in terms of being their team principal? Is he going to be an advisor for another team? Is he going to go into Cadillac and help them go into the sport? Is he going to jump into Audi? Who knows? Only time will tell. Now, after Horner getting fired, Laurel Mekies took over as the CEO and team principal of Red Bull Racing, with Alan Permian, if that's his name. Apologies, I am shit at trying to pronounce people's names. Replaced Mekies as team principal of Racing Bulls. Now, moving away from the drama or the top stories from this last couple of weekends, we're actually going to take a look at FP1 now. So, at the very start of the session, Carlos Sainz was saying over his team radio that there was something wrong with this power unit. Now, even from the onboard cameras, we actually did see, or we actually heard, that his car was revving constantly. So it's like he had his foot just constantly on the accelerator, or if you've got a motorbike, you're just twisting the throttle just constantly. You know, here, get the revs up. Now, if the actual car itself was kind of stuck in gear, it was just revving constantly. Then a little later into the session, we actually heard that it was an actual fuel system problem with his car. So Williams actually took his car back into the garage to investigate kind of heavily into the issue to try and fix the actual problem itself. Now, for that FP1 session, or frankly the whole weekend, we actually saw Pirelli change the actual compound of the tyres, which kind of encouraged the team to go for more of a 2-stop strategy, which actually during the race we saw only like 3 or 4 drivers actually stop twice. The majority of the grid managed to get those medium tires right to the end on just a standard 1 stop. Then at the end of our FP1 session, our 3 fastest drivers were Piastri in P1, Verstappen in P2, then Norris in P3. Now, this weekend, we actually saw a bit of a shake-up, a bit of a change-up in the standard race formats, with this week hosting a sprint race. Now, this marks the 3rd sprint race this year so far, and that now leaves 3 more for the rest of the season to go. Now, at the start of our SQ1 session, as the cars were actually leaving the garages, Hulkenberg was noted for an unsafe release, which he did end up pushing in front of Liam Lawson. It was then later updated by the stewards themselves to where no further action was needed. Now, later in the session as well, while on a push lap, Kimi Antonelli actually spun his car 360 degrees into the gravel. But we even seen again from some of the onboard footage, he was just carrying way too much momentum into the corner and spun out. Now, he did get lucky where he didn't end up actually beaching his car, but he did end up flat spotting his tires. But the sprint qualifying session actually limits the amount of tire changes that a person can do. it limits them so much to where they can't change their tires. So we only had to make those tires last to the end of the session. And then they could change them at the end, going into SQ2, if he actually made it into S2Q, of course, which he ended up didn't do, unfortunately. Then at the final 2 corners, as he was on a flying lap to make it into SQ2, Hamilton, from it looks like, again, from the onboards or even the broadcast cameras, he locked his rear wheels under braking and spun his car, which instantly ended his quali session, which did end up dropping him down to P18. Now, this weekend, Ferrari did see some upgrades, I say upgrades in quotes, to the rear suspension to both Hamilton and Leclerc's cars. Now, could that possibly be a contributor to why Hamilton spun? Or is it just straight up just driver error? He just unfortunately spun his car out, you know? It happens to rookies. It happens to 7-time world champions, 8-time world champion. But at the end of that SQ1 session, we did lose our first 5 drivers, those being Albon, Hülkenberg, Hamilton, Colapinto, and Antonelli. Now, moving on to SQ2. Now, this is part of the sport where I just don't understand. What is up with the team strategies where they just waste 6-ish minutes of the quali session just sitting in the garage? I mean, would it not be beneficial for the drivers to get more than just one attempt at a fastest lap? Go out there, put a good lap in, come back into the pits, talk about strategy, say what they can improve, what they can improve. Yes, they can change tires, but they'll have to keep the same tires. Then they can go back out again, recharge the battery, get the tires warmed up again, and attempt one more lap. But again, who knows? But it's just one of those things that it's shit being a spectator watching no cars out on the grid when you spend thousands and thousands of dollars, thousands of pounds, euros, whatever country you're coming from, to go to a Formula One race and see no cars out on track, especially during a qualifying session. Yes, it's sprint qualifying, but it's still racing. It's still a qualifying session, and there's no cars out on track. Well, there's a reason why teams get paid hundreds of millions per year and they're worth billions. They obviously know a little bit more than I do, but it's just a strange thing to see. Then, as it was more of a stranger session, it was quite tense actually at the end, as basically all the drivers were having to push hard for a fastest lap. But at the end, we did lose another 5 drivers, and those are our final 5 drivers. And those being Lawson, Tsunoda, Russell, both Astons in terms of Alonso and Stroll. And here we go again. So the third qualifying session, or SQ3, was basically just more of the same of SQ2. Cars missing out half of the session, just sitting in their garages. And it's just, again, even for just people watching it at home, it's frustrating to see. Even though there are championship points up for grabs, it just seems like teams just don't care or don't give a shit about the sprint format. It's like at the end of the year, like how is Lando or Piastri or even Verstappen going to feel when looking back on it, going out and getting a pole position in a sprint qualifying session, whether it be in Belgium in this race and one of the future races or even in the previous ones, where getting those extra points, extra 1 point, makes all the difference in terms of them winning the championship versus not winning it. But again, it's a bit above my pay grade. Maybe in the future we'll kind of learn a bit more. We'll dive into it a bit deeper. But at the end of the SQ3 session, Oscar Piastri took pole for the sprint race on Saturday. And then he was followed up on the podium by Verstappen in P2, or podium on the front rows, by Verstappen in P2, Norris in P3, then Leclerc in P4. Then before the sprint race actually even started, we later found out that Alpine, against Parc Fermé rules, changed Colapinto's rear wing, and due to that Parc Fermé rule infraction, he had to start from the pit lane. Now, Colapinto, you could make the argument, is he a better replacement than Jack Doohan? Even though he's the only one currently on the grid now without any points, without scoring any points. Yes, he missed the first two or three races, but this is now race 13, and he hasn't scored any points. Is he a better replacement? I highly doubt it. Then again, it's just not a good start for Saturday's racing for Alpine, as other than Carlo Pinto, Gasly will not complete the race as his car had a suspected water leak. We did see later in the race something quite strange, and again, I didn't know this was actually allowed. We actually saw Gasly rejoin the race. So we actually rejoined the race, and we even saw from wherever you're watching it, for me it's Sky Sports, you saw the wee map on the side. You kind of saw him just out on his own. Everybody else was following a big DRS train. It was just him, just a couple of laps down, just in his own wee bubble, probably testing out strategies for Sunday. But is that only a thing with the sprint races where the drivers can join the race when they don't start it? But I think he's I don't know if it's happened in the past, but the driver most recent to have a DNF and a DNS. He didn't start the race and he didn't finish the race. So it's a bit of a weird stat to have on your career. Then, as there wasn't many points up for grabs, we didn't see a massive amount of overtakes, as the drivers more than likely didn't want to risk damaging their cars, possibly crashing out before Grand Prix qualifying starts. Now, for the 12th time in his career, Max Verstappen wins. Now, he is followed up on the podium by Piastri in P2, then Norris in P3. So now we're going to look ahead to GP qualifying that happened later on that Saturday. Then even before the qualifying Q1 session started, while the cars were actually queuing up, or when the cars were coming out of the pit lane into the fast lane to get out onto the track, Ollie Berman tried to push his way in front of Alonso. Now, he did almost make contact, and which the stewards later noted that as an incident. But again, same with one of the other sessions earlier in the Saturday or the Friday, the stewards basically said no further action was needed. But before most of the cars actually got out on track, there was even more drama in the pit lane, when Hulkenberg was turning into the fast lane. Stroll didn't actually let him in, which he's not obliged to. So Stroll, I think Hulkenberg was actually peeking over the edge of the standard pit, the leaning over the fast lane, and Stroll did end up driving over Hulkenberg's front wing and broke the end plate, which he had to be wheeled back, and the Salba mechanics ended up just replacing his front wing. Then it was getting quite tight at the end of Q1 as Hamilton was in the elimination zone, but because he did put a decent lap together, he did make it through into Q2. But who didn't make it into Q2, you may ask? We did lose our first 5 drivers, those being Bortoleto, Colapinto, Antonelli, and again both Astons of Alonso and Stroll. Then before the Q2 session started, we were updated to say that Hamilton's lap time was actually deleted because he did exceed track limits, which did drop him back down into P16, which basically made him out of qualifying. They just cancelled his qualifying session altogether. But in doing that, it did bump Bortoleto back up into Q2, which was a good for him because he wasn't out in Q1. But during the Q2 session, this one was one of the more quieter sessions, as only Ollie Berman really had any issues when he lost the rear of his car, but he did manage to keep it on track and not smash it into the barriers or run into the gravel and get himself beached. But we did lose our final 5 drivers in this session. First off were both Haas cars with Ocon and again Berman. Then there was Gasly, Hulkenberg and Sainz. Then there was a moment in Q3 where Albon put his right rear wheel into the gravel, and he did almost exceed track limits again for kind of even what kind of happened to Hamilton in the previous session, well, in the Q1 session, where if he exceeded track limits, but in this time Albon didn't, as the broadcast camera showed his left front wheel was still on the white part of the curbing, so he was lucky not to have his time deleted. But with that, again, same with the previous sessions, it was a kind of a quieter session. You know, best drivers in the world don't make a lot of mistakes. But that did bring us to an end of qualifying for the Belgian Grand Prix. And our pole sitter for the race on Sunday was Lando Norris, which for the fourth time this season makes him a pole sitter. Now, he was followed on the front rows by Piastri in P2, Leclerc in P3, then Verstappen in P4. Now, on to Sunday for the actual Grand Prix itself. So, before the race even started, we only saw 16 cars actually start the race from the grid, as the other four drivers, or the other four cars, had to start from the pit lane. So, Antonelli, Alonso, and Hamilton all had their power unit replaced, as Sainz just needed some setup changes, which again was against Parc Fermé rules, which, same with the other three drivers, made him start from the pit lane. Now, while the cars were on their formation lap, race control later red flagged the race, and the actual race start had to be suspended due to the weather conditions. Now, after a delay of about an hour or so, the race finally got started, but the race started with 2 laps under the safety car, which later then pitted to let the race continue as normal. So for letting the cars start under the safety car, that was, as we saw, fucking drive a line on the track, like basically dry off the racing line on the track, so cars didn't have to go into full wets. I think they moved off intermediates to go into mediums, which again, as I kind of said earlier, some of them made that last only on the one stop, which Pirelli wanted to make it 2, but they can go fuck themselves. But majority of them just lasted on the medium. Then the race as a whole was very uneventful. To be fair, I think they were more cautious, if anything, due to the weather, as there wasn't really a lot of overtaking, especially for us kind of waiting over an hour for the actual race to start for nothing really to happen. So even we saw it out in front, it was a one-man show, as Oscar Piastri just controlled the pack the entire time. No one ever really got close to him. Then, at the end of the Belgian Grand Prix, marking his 6th win this year and his 8th win overall in his career, Oscar Piastri won the Belgian Grand Prix. Now, this win puts him 16 points clear in P1 for the Drivers' Championship, with his teammate being a close second, with Lando Norris being a close second in P2. And that will bring us to the end of this week's episode of the Bells Club podcast. I wanted to thank you all for listening to this week's episode. And if you feel like you've enjoyed, please feel free to follow us here on wherever you get your podcasts. And I look forward to talking to Sean next week for round 14 or the Hungarian Grand Prix. Goodbye, everybody.